Howdy, folks. Justin here. Welcome to episode 5 of From Loser to Legend, where we will hopefully help you get from that guy up top who's a loser to my hands getting cut off here. That guy over there, not Admiral Ackbar, but the other guy with the medals and the sunglasses, who is a legend. Today we're talking about traps, and to highlight this concept, I brought along special guest host Admiral Ackbar, who is pretty good at knowing when things are traps and when they're not. Although he probably should have known that the Death Star was fully operational um, before he got there. I mean, he just didn't do his homework, didn't do his research, and he didn't watch From Loser to Legend episode 5 about traps like you should, which is why he now has the experience, of course, to help co-host this episode. Okay, that's enough of that. So we're going to get rid of this image now and start talking about traps. And what do I mean when I say traps? So what I'm talking about is moves that seem reasonable at the time, plays that seem reasonable at the time, that end up being not the play you really should have made. A lot of the time, it's easy to look back at a game, especially if you record them and then you watch them, and say, "Oh my God, like, why didn't I save this move then, or why did I do this then?" Because you, of course, have the benefit of looking back on it. You have the benefit of hindsight. But some of these things that I'm going to talk about today are things that, just by keeping in mind before you go into a match, you might be able to use to counter your own instinct to make a play that seems right at the time that ultimately is not. There's a few different kind of categories of traps I'm going to talk about today. The first of which is overextending. When I talk about overextending, what I mean is taking a deck, usually a more aggressive deck, and throwing out everything on your hand onto the board. There are definitely matchups where this is the correct move. Unfortunately, decks that are running mass removal spells, reactive opponents, are kind of hoping you do this so they get a good ice storm. So we're going to look at some cards that you want to avoid overextending into, and then we're going to talk about which decks you should try to play around them against. So in red, we have one mass removal spell that sees play, and that is Burn and Pillage. Burn and Pillage is a great card, deals 1 damage to each enemy creature for each rune you've destroyed of theirs. Burn and Pillage is not found in control decks necessarily, although I've seen it in more controlling Battle Mage builds before. But to play around Burn and Pillage is probably the trickiest of all of these cards that you don't want to overextend into. But what you need to keep in mind is when you're trying to play around Burn and Pillage, the only time you're going to have the ability to is if you find yourself in a position in the later parts of the game where your opponent is drawing one card a turn, they've got 1 card in hand maybe, or no cards in hand, and you're trying to establish a board, right? You're trying to establish the ability for yourself to claw back into the game. If you think your opponent's running Burn and Pillage, and a good way to tell if your opponent's running Burn and Pillage is, are they playing Crusader, are they playing Archer, which are the decks you're going to see more Burn and Pillages in than anything else. Your instinct is going to be to claw back into the game with drain creatures and cover yourself with guard creatures, particularly in the shadow lane if you don't have any creatures there yet. To avoid losing to Burn and Pillage, I would suggest laying down 1 drain creature at a time, focusing on playing a single large defensive guard creature in a shadow lane, and also not laying down multiple guard creatures with small toughness like a 2/3 with guard or a 1/3 with guard, and having any sort of expectation of it surviving long enough to actually do any work defending you. The drain creatures I'm specifically referring to, of course, are Night Shadow and Moonlight Werebat. I cannot imagine a situation where you think your opponent's running Burn and Pillage where you're going to want to lay down more than 1 of these at a time. If you're gaining 6 life by swinging at your opponent's face, you're basically doubling the chance of them drawing Burn and Pillage if you're attacking with a Night Shadow. So to play around Burn and Pillage, to not overextend into Burn and Pillage, is the rare instance of needing to not overextend when you're playing a control deck. But in that case, I think the best suggestion is just 1 at a time. Make sure you have 1 large guard creature in each lane, and that way, you're just as susceptible to single target removal as you are to Burn and Pillage. A few specific card notes: don't hesitate, of course, to drop down as many House Kinsmen as you have. Because when those die, you'll gain life. You probably want to gain life, and also don't necessarily hesitate to drop down Daggerfall Mage, which is not the card I was looking for, but Telvanni Arcanist, because again, Telvanni Arcanist going to put a card in your hand that might put you in a better position than you would be otherwise, and just having a 3/2 on the board when you're in a position to potentially lose to Burn and Pillage is not something that is going to do you a whole lot of good. The other cards we're on blue now, so we're going to talk about a couple blue cards. Ice Storm, not overextending in Ice Storm is probably the card you need to avoid overextending into the most. In this case, it's very simple. Going into turn 5, if they have the elixir, through turn 8 or so, just do not overextend. Do not put more creatures on the board than you need to reasonably pressure your opponent at any given time. And since you're probably playing against Control Mage, although you might be playing against Battle Mage as well, another suggestion that I would make in this matchup is remember that it's not important that you win right away, especially against Control Mage. Since Control Mage's plan to get back into the game is through Manticoras or Pillaging Tribune most of the time, your best bet is controlling the board and putting them in a position where if they Ice Storm, they are getting minimal value, right? Um, if that means only having 3 creatures on the board, that's fine. Try to never give your opponent an opportunity to get more than a 3-for-1 with Ice Storm. And this is a case actually where I would sort of hesitate to put my House Kinsman down on the board, just because if you hit your opponent with your House Kinsman in the face once after an Ice Storm, you're basically guaranteed to hit them for at least 6 instead of just 3, because they don't really have any ways to remove, to silence that card, to remove the last gasp effect. This is a matchup where you also need to consider, like, let's say your opponent has a 3/6 guard in one lane, and you throw down a 3/6 guard in that same lane. If you suspect your opponent of running Ice Storm, maybe you just put the 3/6 guard creature into the lane that your opponent doesn't have a creature in, so that they're using, they're either not able to remove your creature and they're just sort of piddling at your face and drawing you cards, or they have to expend multiple cards to remove your creature, in which case it's not really overextending. I mean, like, if they're trading 1-for-1 with all your cards, like, you're still ending up okay because you're pressuring their life total. Just to make sure that you also keep in mind that removing the board of a Control Mage opponent is pretty important, considering how much life they can gain with Pillaging Tribune. As far as blue is also home to Firestorm, I'll just make a brief mention of this. If you suspect your opponent's running Firestorm, and there's not really any reason to, because it's not run in very many decks at all, but if you suspect your opponent running Firestorm, the solution here is obvious. If the deck is running Firestorm and not Ice Storm, which seems unlikely, just spread your creatures out to both lanes. But in addition to that, be cognizant of the fact that when you're hitting Prophecy and you suspect your opponent's running Firestorm, when you're breaking your rune, you know, swing with the creatures who have 2 toughness first, right? As far as cards that impact how you want to set up your creatures in lanes, there are 2 in yellow that see a moderate amount of play, and you can basically play around them both the same way. Immolating Blast, not a card that sees a whole lot of play, but it does see play. And what you want to do with Immolating Blast is pretty simple. Spread your creatures out, right? Overextending into Immolating Blast is kind of a difficult challenge to fight against, simply because your opponent, expecting Immolating Blast is sort of might do more damage to your game than playing around it, because it's so rarely played. But this just goes to support what I was saying already, which is that playing creatures into both lanes, I think, is a super important move in almost every matchup. Dawn's Wrath, I don't own any Dawn's Wraths. I don't play Control Mage, and my Spellsword Control and my Monk Control lists don't run it either. But Dawn's Wrath is a great card that sees quite a bit of play in control decks running Willpower. Basically, the same thing that applies to your overextending against other removal spells. Makes sense for this one. Only get on the board what you need to reasonably pressure your opponent, which is going to be different for each matchup. The turns that you need to kill your opponent by vary based on the matchup. Getting to turn 10, you need to be where your opponent's going to have Manticora if they're playing yellow and they're a control deck. So you want to pressure them to the point where a Manticora will not save them on turn 10. Playing around Dawn's Wrath is basically the same as playing around Immolating Blast. Spread your threats out in multiple lanes. Keep creatures in your hand if you suspect your opponent is setting up the board for a removal spell. Just don't overextend. The other one that you really ever see, of course, is Odoving. Odoving is great. It's in basically every control deck. Deals 4 damage to all enemy creatures. This is a card that you basically just need to play around as if you were playing around Ice Storm. It's going to be much more devastating to you, both because of the amount of damage dealt and the fact that it's also a 10/10 creature that can quickly end the game. But that's a card you need to keep in mind. That's going to be in your Mage control decks, going to be in your Spellsword control decks, might be in your Monk control decks, might be in your Warrior control decks, definitely going to be in your Scout decks. So that's Overextending. Basically, play it safe. Don't think that you need to win the game right away. Recognize the key points in your opponent's turn progression where you want to have put a suitable amount of pressure on before they're going to be able to stabilize with cards like Manticora or Odoving. But also, this also means part of Overextending means like if you have a charge creature in hand, don't feel obligated to play it just because you have extra magic on your turn and you want to play it. Your opponent is likely to wipe the board if they're playing a control deck. If you have a charge creature, that's a creature that you can instantly get some value out of the minute they wipe the board. So, this sort of brings me to my next little thing I wanted to talk about, my next trap you can fall into. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to play an incredibly aggressive one-dimensional deck against the AI. And this trap is pushing too hard, too fast, and running out of gas. Okay. This deck does this all the time. It's why it's not a particularly competitive deck. And we're playing against mono purple, and I'm going to illustrate for you why this... we'll keep that. I'm going to illustrate for you why this is so dangerous. So, pushing too hard, too fast creates two problems. Your opponent draws a ton of extra cards, and you do not. And as the game goes on, the larger cards that are played one at a time in slower turns quickly outclass the quicker, smaller cards that you're running. And actually, you know what's funny is it actually appears that we are not going to get the opportunity to overextend because our opponent's playing guard.dead. But I'm going to try to overextend. And either way, the point stands. Pushing too hard, too fast doesn't leave yourself any resources to win the game. And while that will not be happening this time, unfortunately, it is something you definitely need to be careful of. You can make the argument, actually, while I try to keep this on topic, that my opponent is sort of doing this by using up all of their elixir charges so quickly and pushing aggressively when they're allowing me to develop this board here. But that's sort of a stretch and not one that I feel is necessarily particularly honest for me to make.
You have been warned. You will die.
Yeah. Oh, we triggered Prophecy. So maybe our all face all day strategy isn't going to work, and this is going to be a great example of what I'm talking about.
You can't defeat me.
Our opponent has 15 on board. We could just be dead.
Face my blade.
But yeah, the idea behind this concept, not pushing too hard, too fast, is that you find yourselves in these situations where you can't win and you can't draw cards fast enough to win because your opponent's just going to stabilize too quickly.
You have been warned.
Come on now. We're actually going to lose.
Won't escape alive.
But, we tried.
We'll hold, no matter what.
And there you go.
Offers something tasty. You can't defeat me.
So as tends to happen when I play against the AI for these examples, I didn't really get the opportunity to lay this out in any sort of coherent way because we're still dead. We don't have any removal in this deck. So there were no prophecies that were going to save us. But yeah. That's the same sort of things that you need to keep in mind when you are working on not pushing too fast, too far, too fast, not running out of gas. Are the sorts of things that you're going to consider when you're playing around a lot of these removal spells that punish you for overextending. These concepts go hand in hand to a large degree. Um, One of the ways you can combat this is by running cards that replace themselves. Or they cycle, right? So some examples of this are Eastmarch Crusader. Comes into play, draws a card, 3 magicka for a 4/2, keeps the pressure moving, but it also gives you another card in hand. Makes it more difficult for you to run out of gas, right? Uh, the poster child for this is, of course, Triumphant Jarl. If you're ahead in life, you draw 2 cards when you play them. Fits in a lot of the same decks as Eastmarch Crusader does, and is basically essential for some of the more aggressive strategies. Beyond that, in blue, there is. Um, oh, I can't remember the name of the card right now. But there is a 4/1 for 4 that replaces itself when you play it. Sees play in some of the more aggressive blue decks, Elusive Schemer. Making sure you run cards like this is basically essential to make sure you do not run out of gas. Another card that does this in a very small way is Thieves Guild Recruit, which sees play in a lot of archer decks because it's a body, it does things, and it keeps you drawing cards. Um, Anything that draws you card is a powerful effect. Goblin Skulk is an example of this that goes into an aggressive deck that draws you cards. But making sure you do not run out of gas is why you run these sorts of cards. Um, that's basically it. There are other examples of this in the less intuitive ways, like Windkeep Spellsword, which even in an aggressive deck allows you the ability to get effectively 4 health worth of value out of this creature, which means it's going to trade much more effectively than your average 2-drop card will. So don't run out of gas. Um, the last thing I really wanted to talk about today, as far as traps that are easy to fall into, is one that I do more than anything else, and that is using removal on low priority targets when, you know, and then the next turn or the 2 turns later getting killed by a high priority target. Uh, to talk about this a little bit, I'm going to help illustrate this point by mentioning a couple specific cards that you should probably hold on to removal for if you can, and then discuss cards that are less important to hold on to removal for. One of the cards that is a great example of this is, of course, Markarth Bannerman. Markarth Bannerman spirals out of control very rapidly if you do not have removal for it. It costs 5 magic and it's a 4/4, so it's not unlikely that you have an answer to it at some point between turns 1 and 5. But if you spent that removal spell getting rid of a rampaging Minotaur, you're going to be SOL when your opponent decides to take you down to Markarth. And I'm pretty sure in Skyrim, Markarth is the place where there's a quest where they strip you of all your equipment, they put you in prison, lock you away. That's what's going to happen to you if you don't have a removal spell on the ready for it. And being able to gauge what is a proper target for your removal is, of course, challenging. Um, in the early game, when your opponent lays down a 1 toughness creature, it can be super tempting to use Murkwater Witch on it. But you have to ask yourself, do I have a Leaf Lurker in my hand that I can combo with this to remove something more threatening later? What is my opponent running, and what are they likely to have that I have to be able to answer? Crushing Blow is a great example of a card that's oftentimes in your hand in the early game. You don't really want a Crushing Blow or a Fighters Guild Recruit or a Thieves Guild Recruit because there are much better targets in mid to late game, be they Daring Cut Purses that are starting to get out of control, or Moonlight Werebats, so on and so forth. Some more cards that you're going to want to be able to answer that are really great illustrations of what just screws you over if you don't have an answer for is one I just touched on, Moonlight Werebat. And Moonlight Werebat is about to get nerfed to 2 toughness. That doesn't mean it's any less of a priority removal target. It just means now you can kill it with Firebolt. I think it's still going to see a lot of play. I think it's still going to be a really powerful card. I'm glad that it's getting nerfed because it is definitely incredibly powerful. But I'm not. I guess I am glad, but I'm not feeling too strongly one way or the other about whether or not it was necessary. Uh, when you're breaking your opponent's runes and you are a deck that doesn't want your opponent to gain life right now, and I say that not facetiously because there are, of course, situations where you can find yourselves largely unconcerned that your opponent's getting 4 life. Like, let's say you're playing a pretty strong control deck and you're not trying to end the game anytime soon. You just need to break a rune, or you are breaking a rune for some reason. Having an answer to Moonlight Werebat in hand is something you need to keep in mind. Moonlight Werebat, too, is going to be in every green deck that you face. So when you're breaking a rune, think, do I have a way to handle a Moonlight Werebat trigger from Prophecy trigger from my opponent? And if you suspect your opponent is playing, Moonlight Werebats, if they're playing Archer, Monk, Scout, Assassin, I mean, they all run it. Mono Green probably runs it. This is a card that you're gonna want to hold on to a removal spell for. If your opponent has a Nimble Ally on the board from turn 3 that didn't trigger and it's just a 3/3 and you have a Crushing Blow in hand, don't feel obligated to remove Nimble Ally. Remember that there is a lot of utility in having your own runes broken and drawing cards and triggering your own prophecies. And Moonlight Werebat's the kind of card that can really swing the game out of your ability to win. So having an answer to that is super important. Also in green, there is probably the best example of this outside of Markarth Bannerman, Quinral Burglar. Quinral Burglar doesn't see a whole lot of play. I mean, I've soul trapped 4 or 5 of them, but Quinral Burglar, if not answered pretty much immediately, is going to make the game unwinnable for you. It might take a while for you to lose that game, but Quinral Burglar needs to have an answer. If you know your opponent's running them, make sure you're prioritizing your ability to remove Quinral Burglar. The other 2 cards that you really need to consider having an answer for, if you think or know your opponent's running them, is of course one of the two. Of course, is Night Shadow. This card's seen a huge uptick in play recently. You need to have a way to answer Night Shadow if you're an aggressive deck, even if it's just for a turn. Holding on to a 2/2 blue harpy creature that can shackle it to make sure that you can push for that lethal. Make sure you have a way to mitigate the potential of a Night Shadow landing on turn 5 or 6. And the other one that I wanted to mention is seen less often, although I think it's a really good card. That card is Master of Thieves. If you don't have a way to answer Master of Thieves and your opponent's playing a Master of Thieves deck, well, you have lost, right? This card's actually pretty difficult to remove, too. It's got 5 toughness. It's going to be played into the Shadowland, I can tell you that much. But if you're playing against a dedicated Pilfer deck, make sure you have an answer to Master of Thieves. It's going to be important that you remove the other Pilfer creatures before they escalate out of control. But the card that's actually going to completely end the game is Master of Thieves plus Thieves Den. So having a way to remove Master of Thieves is super important. Anyway, I hope that this episode helped you out a little bit. This was Loser to Legend Episode 5. We talked about traps you can fall into and hopefully some ways that you can counter that. And honestly, I think just being aware sometimes of these sorts of things, or having someone else say them and have you hearing it, can really make all the difference in the world in your game. So I hope this went well. I look forward to seeing you all on the ladder this week, and I look forward to seeing you in From Loser to Legend Episode 6 next Sunday. Thank you very much. Have a great day, and I'll hopefully run into you in a game. Bye-bye.